Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim. I'm the exhibit technician here at the Mariners Museum. In a moment, John Quarstein will talk about the fall of Fort Fisher. But before we start, I just want to get a couple of things out of the way. First, I just want to let everybody know that images related to the talk today will be in the link in the description below. Second, we have a short Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So feel free to put some questions that you have in the live chat. We'll try to answer them best we can. And then lastly, please subscribe. If you like this kind of thing, hit that notification button. We look forward to bringing more of this kind of content to you. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and let John take it away. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Quarstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum. Yes, my hair is getting long, because of the isolation. I guess if I was back in college, I think it's groovy, but now I'm bald, so what can I say? Actually, today, I'm going to talk about the fortifications that defended Cape Fear, Cape Fear River, and therefore Wilmington. And I think in 2 weeks hence, I'll be talking about the actual capture of it. So what made the Wilmington so important? Well, I have to tell you, Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, declared a blockade of the Confederate coastline from the Chesapeake Bay to the Rio Grande, and the Navy didn't have enough ships, but nevertheless, they started this really concerted effort to strive to block every harbor they could. So I have to tell you, as the blockade became more effective, the best port to come into that supported the Army of Northern Virginia up in Richmond, outside of Richmond, is, of course, Wilmington. Now, what made Wilmington so good? Well, number one, it has these rail connections. You could leave Wilmington and you go straight up to Richmond. You could go all the way out to Charlotte, then up to Danville, then back to Richmond. So they had two amazing routes they could use to ferry supplies, because these blockade runners, actually they became purpose-built ships. When I call them purpose-built ships, they realized they had to have a couple of things, especially if you're going into Fort Fisher or to the Cape Fear. So you had to have a light draft. You had to have anthracite coal, which doesn't blow black, and you had to have a very fast vessel. In fact, you wanted your vessel faster than anybody else's, because when you look at the map and you see Wilmington is 625 miles from 674 miles from Bermuda and 570 miles from Nassau. So big ships would come to like St. George's in Bermuda, offload all these weapons and clothing and medicines and even stuff for the civilian market. And then they would put them in these smaller, fast ships, and they'd make a run into Wilmington. Now, what made Wilmington the best happened to be that there are two entrances to the Cape Fear River. And you can see, if you look at some of the pictures that are with this program, you can see I used two maps, and you'll see exactly, one's called the Old Inlet and one is called the New Inlet. And so obviously the New Inlet was caused by a hurricane. In these entrances were far enough apart that a blockade runner leaving Wilmington could get to Smithfield, North Carolina, and they could look out where the blockaders were, both Old and New Inlet. However, for the Union to guard this place, because there's this huge shoal that comes off of Oak Island, and it is called Frying Pan Shoal. So it looks like a frying pan. So the Federals have to have a 50-mile ring, and they had it in depth. In other words, they were ships way farther out to sea, looking for these probable routes that the blockade runners are going to take. And then also there was a tighter ring closer to. But because of the defenses of the Cape Fear, blockade runners couldn't quite make it, or blockaders couldn't always get close enough to hit those ships. And so basically, the Confederacy, once Charleston is really closed as a port. Charleston does not have, it has one major entrance. And, so what's going to happen is that Wilmington becomes the leading blockade runner haven in the Confederacy. Consequently, it has to be ever so well defended. And so they have an inner river, and then they have the outer river defenses. And so this is a whole series of fortifications. One of my favorite happens to be Fort Anderson. And Anderson just so happened to be a fort originally built by the British in the 1740s. And so it was the War of Austrian Secession. And so, wow, they wanted to defend their ports against the French, basically. And so that fort fell into disrepair when, the United States became a nation. The British come in and destroy the original fort. And this fort was built in the middle of a town called Brunswick Town. And Brunswick Town, of course, was abandoned for various reasons because of the burning of it. And so when you go to Fort Anderson today, you go through an archaeological site, and then you see the fort itself. It was originally named Fort St. Philip. I have to say that it's named Anderson in honor of Brigadier General George Anderson, who just so happened to have been killed at Antietam, and he's from North Carolina, so we're going to name a fort in honor of him. And so the fort had two 32-pounder rifles and also 7 32-pounder smoothbores. Now, how do you get a 32-pounder rifle? Well, you've got to heat that gun up, and you got to use a rifling machine to do the 7 lands and grooves. And if you're smart, you will put a band on it. Not everyone did that, so they were prone to bursting, but that's the best the Confederates could do. Now, just a few miles down below Brunswick Town happens to be what is known as Smithfield. Now, Smithfield is not a major port, but it's an anchorage, and it's going to be defended by one battery known as Fort Pender. This is a 4-gun battery. So what makes it really great is his name for Major General William Dorsey Pender. And Pender was killed at Gettysburg. So once again, we're trying to honor these Confederate heroes and by naming a fort in honor of them. The major defensive work there was known as Fort Branch, originally called Fort Johnson, but Lawrence O'Brien Branch is actually at the Battle of Antietam. His brigade is with the A.P. Hill's division. And so, they show up, and he's actually on his horse next to Lee and some other officers, and a shot goes through his throat, drops dead right away. So we got to name a fort in honor of him because he used to be a congressman from Carolina. And so then that's what made him such a general. So I have to tell you that this fort, Fort Johnson, had originally been built by the British and then rebuilt by the Corps of Engineers starting in 1794. We realized we had to have some coastal defense. It was not well completed. This thing has a semicircular front, which is for the cannon, and then it has the diagonal lines for the land face. This gun, this semicircular fort was made out of tabby. And everyone goes, what's tabby? Well, tabby is this mixture of lime, oyster shells, seashells, and a little bit of sand, and you actually make this tabby, which you then can apply like stucco you would apply to a house. So it's a very southern thing, tabby. And in fact, the city most famous for tabby is Savannah. And actually, all the bricks look different because they have a different color because they're using different earth and also different types of shells. So anyway, I got to tell you that the Smithfield, as I said, was the perfect answer for blockade runners because it could look out both the inlets. So that was pretty good. The old inlet, which is also called the Western Bar, was defended at its entrance on both sides. It's on Oak Island, and on both sides it's going to be defended. Now, the main fort is going to be known as Fort Caswell. Now, Fort Caswell is going to, Oak Island actually reaches out into Frying Pan Shoals. So, oh my gosh. So it's a great exit if you can take it. Fort Caswell was one of those third system of fortifications that are going to be built after the War of 1812, because the earlier designed forts didn't do but so well. So Fort Caswell is a very typical fortification. It has 61 gun emplacements. However, it's only going to have so many guns in it. 29 heavy Seacoast 32 pounders will be in it. They're going to be called Columbiads. We also had that Fort Caswell was named for the governor of North Carolina at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Richard Caswell. And so there are memorials to him everywhere. Well, let me tell you, now there's also a one-gun battery Shaw named for Colonel Shaw, who's killed during the attack on New Bern. Then we also have Smith Island, which is on the other side of the old inlet. And this is on, today is called Bald Head Island. Back in the old days, they called it Smith Home or Smith Battery. And as a result of that, it will get a fort. The fort is going to be built by the Confederates. In fact, they're still building it. In late 1864, it's called Fort Holmes, and it's named for Theophilus Holmes, another Confederate general. And so now, let's get to the real thing, Fort Fisher. Let me tell you, it was the largest earthen fortification in the world, and it's going to be built. At first, they just build a small battery down there. It's not effective. But what they then do is a new person shows up. His name is Colonel William Lamb. And Lamb is a graduate college of William Mary. He was a newspaper editor. Just think, he graduated from college and his father gave him a newspaper. Oh, wow. So he takes over the fort in 1862, and the commander of the district is Major General William Chase Henry Whiting. And Whiting is graduated first in his class at West Point. He's an engineer. So they start to copy what are called Maloloff towers. And during the Crimean War, the Russians at first had this limestone tower that went up 3 stories to focus fire on the approaching, but then they put earth around it. And so the earth absorbs the shot, unlike a tabby fort or a brick fort. This is the smartest way to go about building it. Now, Fort Fisher will actually be a tremendous fortification. Now, they have a land face, which is consists of sod cover mounds of sand, basically, that guarded the land approach to Fort Fisher. This has it's 1,800 feet facing out. So they're quite a few of these mounds. They're also called traverses. They're usually about 30 feet wide and supported with heavy timbers. Every time you have one of these mounds or traverses, you actually built a bomb proof inside of it. You built a magazine inside of it. Now, what really, this land face featured 15 10-inch Columbiads, one 7-inch Brook rifle, 4 8-inch Columbiads, and 2 24-pounder Coehorn mortars, and 1 10-inch mortar. Sometimes it's called an 8-inch. But nevertheless, so we have this tremendous land face, but then it comes to the Mound Battery, and it's the northeast bastion, which faces out towards the sea. It is a tremendous place because it is featuring some of the best guns the Confederacy has. Several 7-inch Brook guns, a Blakely rifle from Great Britain, an 8-inch Blakely rifle, and then a 150-pounder Armstrong gun. So we have just on the sea face, they will be 29 heavy guns. And then out in front of that will be a wooden stake fence that goes from the Cape Fear River out front the land face and down to the sea. And that is to have another way of stopping an enemy from trying to attack. See, coastal defense forces, you can always be taken by land because they focus on the sea. So Fort Fisher, however, the Federals had known it was a bad place from the very beginning. In fact, in 1862, Gideon Welles comes up with a plan to send monitors in through the new inlet and actually bombard Fort Fisher and Wilmington and Caswell from the rear. Oh my gosh, what a great idea. In fact, the Monitor is going to Beaufort, North Carolina to join up with other ships to send the attack. Well, let me tell you, all of a sudden they realized that Passaic-class monitors and the Monitor itself did not have the draft to go in. It's a 9-foot draft at high tide. That's why they had made these special blockade runner ships. And you have to realize that had they assaulted Fort Fisher in January of 1863, they more than likely would have been able to capture it. But there are all these other needs that the Union had. And as a result of that, they actually do not take a chance at Wilmington until late in the war. Now, I have to also tell you that the Union recognized that Lee's army is being fed through Wilmington. And that issue is what makes them try to break the stalemate outside of Petersburg by limiting the amount of food and other type of supplies that came in. Just one ship alone, known as the Robert E. Lee, made the passage into and out of the Cape Fear River 21 times before it was captured. And the profits by these blockade runners were as much as 700%. Actually, with the first successful voyage, you paid for your ship. In the last months of the war, from September to early January, well, September 1864, and January 1865, Wilmington will receive 69,000 rifles, 43 cannon, 4 tons of meat, 500,000 pairs of shoes, and a ton of saltpeter to make gunpowder with. So, this is a citadel. That's why Fort Fisher was known as the Gibraltar of the South. Now, I'm going to do another one of these programs I think next month that's going to talk about the capture. But I wanted you really, since I only have so much time and I'm talkative and I've gone over anyway. But I wanted you to realize the defense in depth. Plus, at Wilmington, they had built 3 ironclads. One of them, the CSS North Carolina actually got worms to eat through its wooden hull, and they had to pump it out every day to stop it from sinking. The Raleigh would go down the Cape Fear River, chase around the blockade runners out in the ocean, and on her way back, she gets caught in a shoal and it breaks her back. So Fort Fisher, the Confederates realized how desperate they were to maintain Wilmington as a blockade runner haven, as I've said, and the Federals finally have the resources in late 1864 to really put an end to Wilmington as a huge place of resupply for Lee's army in Virginia. So I want to thank you all for listening today. I have to say that my real hero in this story is William Lamb. He knows nothing about fortifications, but he learns from one of the great engineers in the old U.S. Army and the Corps of Engineers, William C.H. Whiting. Okay, so anyway, thank you all very much. If you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. And once again, I'm going to do another one of these in June. I didn't bring my calendar down, but we'll put the promotion out, and that is going to talk about Ben Butler and the powder boat scheme, and then Alfred Terry with David Dixon Porter having a successful attack on Fort Fisher. And so that's a great story because it involves two of the worst generals, Braxton Bragg and Benjamin Franklin Butler. So I'll have a lot of fun with that, I do believe. And so I'm ready for your questions. Are you going to? Do I?
So here, John, I'll just read them to you. I guess we forgot to bring that up earlier, but okay. So I have a question here. In your opinion, why did the district commander, Bragg, not send more troops to defend Fort Fisher? If he did send more troops, do you think they would have repelled the federal attack?
Well, I do believe that Bragg made a huge mistake. No one else, now that he was aware that Sherman is coming up into the Carolinas, but his real thing is maintaining Wilmington as a blockade runner haven. They have Major General Hoke, who has 4,500 men on the peninsula that leads to what once was called Federal Point, now called Confederate Point. And so Hoke has 4,500 men. Now, Bragg has access to 12,000 men. Terry has 6,000 men. So you can well imagine that if Terry attacks the land face of Fort Fisher, if Hoke has enough men, he can attack Terry at the rear. So it would have saved Fort Fisher for at least a little while longer. But yeah, that was a huge mistake. And I like to say, how do you spell defeat? And that's B-R-A-G-G, Bragg. So any other questions?
Yeah, we've got another one here. What happened to the ironclads built at Wilmington?
Well, I think I made reference to them. The Raleigh, which was very similar, it's a diamond-shaped casemate, so that it had shallow draft, and it was a pretty good ship. By that time, the Confederates have really solved some of the engine problems, and it's going to be taken out, and then it runs aground, and as a result of that, it broke its back and was just a forlorn turtle. I told you about the North Carolina, and that is, you would think that Wilmington would be a shipbuilding center. However, for some reason, they just cannot make effective ironclads there.
All right, I've got another one here. Why do you think the Confederacy did not treat Fort Fisher more importantly? Was their focus too much on the events in Virginia?
Well, they, basically Lee knew that he had to defend Richmond because it was a munitions center. I mean, that's where they had the Richmond Armory, Tredegar Iron Works, Galileo Mills. And so all those resources had to be protected. And so, but what Lee will do is we're going to learn from another program I'm going to do about the CSS Albemarle, is Lee is going to actually send troops into North Carolina, and that's Hoke's division. And Hoke's division will be most effective in working with the ironclad Albemarle and in liberating several eastern North Carolina port cities, river port cities. And once again, the Federals couldn't get an ironclad into the North Carolina Sound, so that gave that advantage. So, but he just didn't have the resources share. The big thing is Bragg's failure to support Robert Hoke and his command. Had he sent 3,000 troops over there to Hoke, Hoke would have had enough men to overwhelm the Federals. And so, but it didn't happen. I don't like to try to make believe history. So, any other questions?
Just one last quick one from me, actually. Did the Confederates have a large supply of the anthracite coal?
No, they didn't. And you really had to go up north to Pennsylvania to get that. They did have it in England, however. And so if your blockade running ship is stopping at St. George's Harbor in Bermuda, you're going to coal your ship. And sometimes there's not enough coal, and so they have to use the smokier version because these things are low and sleek profile in the water, and they they're hard to spot, especially moonless nights and stormy conditions. And the blockade runners always had these excellent pilots that really knew how to, at one point, they're going to make it to New Inlet or Old Inlet. And the big thing is, once you got under the cover of Fort Caswell, you got under the cover of Fort Fisher, you were in perfect state. So Fort Fisher actually had another battery next to it called Battery Buchanan, managed by naval personnel. But atop the one battery, they have a beacon light for blockade runners. And so that is the Pulpit Battery. And that's really a Molotov tower of sorts, 60 feet above the sea face. So you can well imagine the plunging shot coming from there, and also the ability to shoot at those blockaders who are trying to catch those blockade runners. And that would, once you got in the range of Fort Fisher, you were safe. So I think it's pretty neat. It's a complex fort. I could talk an hour just about it, but what can I say? Anyway, I thank you all for participating, and I look forward to our next show, which will be about the CSS Albemarle. And then I'm going to do another one on Fort Fisher in June as well. So, because I want to get it captured. So without further ado, once again, I'm John Quarstein. We have, if you go to the museum's blogs, you can see I wrote a blog on Fort Fisher, Gibraltar of the South. You think about Gibraltar, the rock that the British were able to control, and they still do. And so it's a great defensive work, and so was Fort Fisher. It's beyond comprehension of how excellent it actually was. So thank you all, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.